Are you hurt? Can you stand?
Amelia Beaumont stopped beneath the stable arch because a drenched man in black evening clothes sat motionless on the stone step, his face buried in his hands while carriages rattled through the freezing rain. She crossed the slick cobbles and held out a hand. "Are you hurt? Can you stand?" He lowered his hands. "No one has died," he said. "The bride has gone." Amelia glanced toward another coach being brought round. "The wind has turned as well. One of those facts will soon be more dangerous than the other." Heroes. Amelia went through the service passage into the abandoned feast room where servants were packing bread and bottles for guests, determined to flee the scandal. "Which coaches take the lower road?" she asked. "All of them miss." Amelia opened her weather ledger across a white napkin. "Then stop them. The lower bend was saturated when I came up. If the surface freezes before the water drains, a loaded coach will slide." Wet footsteps sounded behind her. The man from the Mews entered, water dripping from his cuffs. The steward hurried forward. "Your Grace." Amelia stared. "The Duke of Shawcross." She had found a duke crying beside his own stable, and then ordered his household to ignore its departure plan. Mortimer came to the table instead of dismissing her. "Show me how you reached it." Amelia pointed to the wind, change the falling barometer, and yesterday's soaked ground. He followed the entries, then turned to the steward. "Stop the carriages. I will answer to the guests." His next question was for Amelia. "These observations are your father's, the older winters are his. Today's readings and calculations are mine. Amelia Beaumont." Mortimer studied the two columns. "Shawcross needs a winter route and provision plan. I would commission you to make it Miss Beaumont, you not your father." The offer was cleanly separated from the ruined wedding. Amelia tightened her grip on the ledger. "I accept. I shall need the estate maps, store counts, and men who know the roads. You shall have them." By morning they were bent over an old survey in the map room. Mortimer tapped an upland road marked in 1789. Steeper but rockier. It ought to drain. Amelia traced the bend. "Yesterday there was standing water here." "When was the ditch last cleared?" Mortimer looked up. "I do not know. Then I cannot call it safe." "An old map is evidence, your Grace. It is not a pair of boots." His mouth twitched. "This map has survived 40 years, Miss Beaumont, possibly because it has never been required to cross its own road." A short, rusty laugh escaped him. "Very well. We inspect the ditch." An hour later, they were on the upland track beneath a bruised grey sky. Amelia dismounted, pulled her measuring chain across the gravel, and noted the wheel ruts while the wind worried the pages of her ledger. The ground was firmer than she had expected. Her first suspicion was losing ground. "The grade is holding," Mortimer said without triumph. Amelia walked to the verge where one boot sank. "Look here." Under frozen scrub ran a deep trench clogged with leaves and fallen earth. Mortimer crouched beside it. A boundary ditch, dug in 1802 between the tenant pastures. It was never meant for drainage, but it must have altered the runoff from the ridge. He broke away a crust of frozen leaves with his glove. Beneath them, a thin thread of water moved toward the road instead of away from it. There it was, the piece his papers knew, and her boots could not. Amelia measured the fall from ditch to verge, then struck through one line in the ledger. Being contradicted by the ground irritated her for perhaps 3 seconds. After that, the correction was more interesting than the mistake. "Clear this section and cut a temporary channel here. Not deep, only enough to turn the runoff before it reaches the wheel track. Then set the marker 6 yards higher." Mortimer followed the line with his eyes. 2 hours with the roadmen, less if the soil has not frozen underneath. A worker approached with a tool cart. "Your Grace, where shall we begin?" Mortimer looked to Amelia. At Miss Beaumont's marker, Mortimer said, "Follow her line. If the water crosses it again, report the place, rather than guessing a new path." Warmth moved through Amelia that had nothing to do with gratitude or rank. He had not merely allowed her to speak, he had made the roadmen responsible to her finding and left the correction attached to her name. He had been contradicted twice in 2 days and seemed to find the fact useful. That was rarer than a title. The following afternoon, they tried the revised route's load in the stable yard. A cart stood ready with firewood and grain, the draft horses steaming in the cold. Amelia walked once around the wheels, pressed her boot into the wet gravel near the gate, and asked the driver how the same axle had behaved on last winter's incline. "Sound enough with flour," the man said, "but timber makes her pull to the left." Amelia checked the iron tire, the axle, and the weight. Too heavy. If the wheel finds a soft patch on the incline, we risk the axle. Mortimer looked from cart to horses. Lighter loads mean more journeys. More journeys mean tired teams, and a greater chance of being caught out after dark. They argued briskly, Amelia for the cart and road surface, Mortimer for horses and daylight. Neither could solve the problem by winning the argument, because the animals, the axle, and the shortening afternoon all had claims on the same journey. "You are spending the axle to save time," Amelia said. "You are spending horses to save wood," he returned. She signaled the driver. The cart rolled 10 feet. The left wheel sank into wet gravel with an ugly groan. Amelia raised an eyebrow. "The axle." Mortimer rubbed the bridge of his nose. "And half-loads will keep us on the road past dusk. We have achieved the rare scholarly condition in which both hypotheses are wrong." Amelia laughed. "This is why I prefer roads to scholars, Your Grace. Roads admit it sooner. Staggered loads, then. Medium weight alternating teams. The grain goes with the first cart timber divided between the next 2. Mortimer glanced at the sunless sky. Gravity appears unwilling to negotiate. Amelia wrote the arrangement down and handed the driver the first load figure herself. Work gave the days a rhythm. Amelia liked measure, dispute, alter, try again. Mortimer's house was still full of whispers about the vanished bride, but he did not drag those whispers into every task. When he brought Amelia a record, it was because the record mattered. In the second week, a culvert failed after hard rain and made nonsense of route markers Amelia had spent a day setting. She chose a temporary turning point while Mortimer examined the old stonework and began explaining to the shivering roadmen why the 1789 masonry had always been prone to trouble. Amelia stepped into his sight. "Your Grace, they need the new turning point before they need 1789. We are losing daylight." Mortimer stopped, looked at the men, and gave only the instruction they needed. He also had the nearest marker cut with a second notch, so a coachman could recognize the changed turning point in poor light. On the walk back, he finished the history for Amelia alone. She listened with pleasure, because now it sharpened the next repair instead of delaying this one. By the time they reached the hall, she had learned something else about him. An interruption could alter his course without becoming an insult. In the third week, Amelia turned to the stores. She counted sacks of oats, flour bins, salted meat, lamp oil, and the wood required to keep the smaller rooms warm if guests remained 3 extra days. Her figures worked, but they cut a costly meat pie from the kitchen plan. The cook stared at the page. "The scullery children have been waiting for that pie since the wedding was announced, miss. It is the only share of the feast they expected." "It takes too much flour and fuel," Amelia said. "We cannot spend the staple stores for custom." Mortimer, arriving behind her, did not order the dish restored. "Perhaps not for custom," he said. "But the house has swallowed a failed wedding and 7 weeks of uncertainty. A little of what was promised may be worth more than its weight in flour." Amelia looked at the cook. "How much can you make without touching what we need for bread?" The cook gave her the oven and fuel limits, then showed her which flour bin could be spared without touching the bread allowance. Amelia changed the portions, crossed one planned pudding from the next day, and found enough margin for the pie after all. Mortimer tried to verify a flour measure and dusted one dark sleeve white. He regarded it as if flour had violated a treaty. Amelia tasted the altered filling and laughed so hard the cook hid a smile. Mortimer, refusing to concede defeat to a kitchen scale, tried again, and this time read the measure correctly. "A triumph," Amelia said. "I shall enter it in the estate record. Please do not." The kitchen laughed with her. Joy had finally become something their work could hold in public. By the 5th week, they practiced turning the abandoned feast room into shelter. Tables went to the walls. Benches, blankets, and braziers were set according to the space Amelia had measured. She noticed Mortimer becoming exact about one central aisle, shifting a table by inches and then shifting it back. "Is that distance needed for the braziers?" she asked, "or do you simply prefer it?" Mortimer rested both hands on the chair back and looked along the empty aisle. "Preference. I am trying to make order out of a room that did not behave according to plan." Then the room may learn another arrangement. They moved the tables. Servants carried blankets in. Footmen tried the quickest path between braziers and doors. When the room could be changed in minutes rather than guessed at in a storm, shoulders eased all around them. A fiddler stranded with the wedding party sat on a crate and struck up a lively reel. Someone clapped time. Mortimer tapped the beat against his thigh with grave concentration. You count dance steps as if they must submit a proof," Amelia said. "Counting is my only defense against being expected to enjoy them." Amelia held out her hand. "Then count this one." He took it. His first turn was poor, the second better. Amelia laughed when he nearly lost the beat, and Mortimer laughed because she had. For a few minutes the room was neither a failed wedding nor an emergency arrangement. It was merely warm, useful, and noisy. When the reel ended, he still held her hand for one beat after the music stopped, then released it with an almost embarrassed bow. Amelia found she wanted more moments in which he forgot to protect himself with explanation. As the 7th week approached, a hard cold came down from the north. Amelia and Mortimer were late on a ridge checking the last markers when one reading refused to match her expectation. "Another hour," Amelia said, drawing her cloak close. "I want the barometer once more." Mortimer pointed toward the whitening track and the steam freezing on the horses' bridles. "We have enough for tonight. We do not have enough light. You become cautious whenever the evidence disagrees with me. I have learned that some experiments deserve a second day rather than a martyr." She looked at the ridge, then at the road home. Annoyingly, he was right. Amelia shut the ledger. They walked the horses back through thin snow, the silence between them easier than conversation had once been. "Being jilted," Mortimer said at last, "is less interesting than everyone insisting they know what it must mean about me." Amelia looked at him in the lantern glow. "I have no useful calculation for that." "Excellent. I should dislike being solved." She smiled into the dark. The feeling between them remained unnamed, and for once she did not resent an unanswered question. Under pressure, however, unanswered questions became harder for both of them to tolerate. As the weather worsened, so did the gossip among the guests. Mortimer heard that servants were being cornered for details about Iris, and that every change of room was being interpreted as some hidden response to the failed wedding. He answered the discomfort in the manner most natural to him by trying to design it out of existence. In the library, he prepared a careful order for room changes, servants' replies, and the occasions on which the wedding might be mentioned. On paper, it was elegant. It left almost no room for uncertainty and very little for people. By morning, servants were repeating phrases they had been given, and several guests were being moved without knowing why. Amelia, preoccupied with the approaching storm, first approved the room changes because they fitted her own labor and heating figures. She moved warming teams and rescheduled stable hands as though an hour of work in one place were the same as an hour anywhere else. By afternoon, both plans had begun to fail. An older guest stopped Mortimer in the passage and asked, voice trembling, whether she was being moved because she had witnessed the broken wedding. He explained the better heat and shorter distance to the stairs. Every fact was true. None answered her question. She flushed, thanked him too quickly, and went away near tears. Mortimer remained where she left him, the neat response paper in his hand. At nearly the same hour, a maid confronted Amelia outside the kitchen. Her team had moved heavy beds twice that week. A stableman sent to haul firewood had already spent the morning on the road crew. Amelia glanced at the columns. The total hours are sufficient. No one answered. The silence made her look up. The maid's hands were red and swollen. The stableman leaned against the wall as if standing had become work. Amelia looked back at the balanced columns and saw the missing quantity at once. She had counted labor and not fatigue. That evening she met Mortimer in the map room. He laid his response paper on the fire. The edges curled, then blackened. I assumed explanation would make people feel safe, he said. Instead, I made them feel arranged. Amelia drew a dark line through 2 pages of labor assignments. I counted the beds and not the people carrying them. For a moment, neither defended the work. That was harder, Amelia discovered, than admitting a wrong number. We lose a day, she said. Then we lose a day. Mortimer went back to the offended guest, told her plainly why the move had been proposed, and restored her choice where safety allowed. Amelia returned to the kitchen and stable yard before making another table of hours. She asked how long people had already worked, who could still lift, who needed rest, and which room changes mattered enough to justify the effort. 1 bed stayed where it was. 2 stablemen were taken off hauling duty. A kitchen maid who had worked since before dawn was sent to sleep before the evening meal. The new arrangement cost them a day and looked less tidy on Amelia's page. It was also one the household could carry without resentment hardening into refusal. Trust returned more slowly than arithmetic, but it returned.
I will mark the doubt as well as the answer.
The new arrangement was scarcely settled before the last storm threatened to arrive. On the evening before the road decision, Amelia sat in the map room with a load sheet, 2 weather pages, and a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. She had checked the same sum twice. Her pencil was beginning a 3rd pass when she stopped it. The figures had not changed. Only her uneasiness had. Across the desk, Mortimer was comparing old freeze dates with the present wind. He had taken off his coat and rolled 1 map corner beneath a brass weight, leaving the rest of Amelia's papers exactly where she had put them. Amelia slid the unfinished sheet toward him. Finish this part for me. The upland wind is the doubtful piece. Use the old freeze entries and mark anything you cannot settle. Her hand remained on the page for half a second too long. The difficulty was not that she doubted his arithmetic. It was that the page was unfinished, and she was giving it away before uncertainty had been beaten flat. Mortimer noticed because, of course, he did. He did not make the moment larger. I will mark that as well as the answer. Good. I must speak to the servants and 2 guests about tomorrow's road arrangements. Amelia stood before she could reclaim the sheet. Near the stair, she found a frightened gentleman blocking Mortimer's way a few minutes later. Snow had yet begun, he insisted. Why should Shawcross keep coaches in merely because a young woman's book predicted trouble? Amelia stayed beyond the pool of lamplight and listened. Mortimer gave him 1 fact: the temperature was falling while the lower road still held water. Then he stopped. The gentleman's fear was not really about drainage. Mortimer seemed to see it. There are warm rooms enough, he said. There is food, and no one here will be thought a coward for refusing a dangerous road. I shall not ask any guest to travel for the sake of my reputation. The man's shoulders loosened. Thank you, Your Grace. When Amelia returned to the map room, Mortimer had finished the figures and placed a small question mark beside one uncertain wind entry. She checked the mark, not the whole sum. Then she added her field note and wrote the decision line beneath both their hands. It was a small act, but harder for her than any argument they had won. She smiled. Before either could speak again, the stable bell rang 3 hard strokes from the coach court. A carriage came in from the lower road at reckless speed, wheels throwing black water against the stones. The horses were white with effort. A groom caught the near bridle as the door opened. Iris Easton stepped down first, pale beneath her bonnet. Ulrich Hartwell followed. The pair had tried to reach the highway and failed. A blocked stretch beyond the estate had turned them back toward the very house they had fled. Whispers travelled faster than they did. By the time Amelia reached the hall, guests had gathered at doors and along the stair. Iris looked from face to face as though each one were a verdict. She went straight to Mortimer. "Your Grace, please. Let tomorrow be called a winter supper. Let everyone leave as planned afterward. If the gathering simply continues, people may believe the separation was agreed before tonight." Ulrich stepped beside her before Mortimer could answer. "Then have our carriage readied as soon as the road appears passable. We need not remain with the rest." Amelia saw Mortimer's attention sharpen. It was not anger first. It was the old temptation to reduce injury to a problem of sequence, who had seen which account might cause the least damage, how soon the house might empty. Her own pencil had made an equally revealing note on the lodging page: 2 more persons, no onward carriage. She stared at the words, ashamed of how quickly fear had made people into quantities again. Amelia shut the ledger. "Miss Easton," she said, "this house can shelter you from the weather. It cannot make the road safe for the sake of a story." Iris turned to her. "You do not understand what happens if everyone remains here. I understand enough. A ruined reputation can be survived. A coach under ice may not be." Ulrich's mouth tightened. "I am prepared to accept the risk." Mortimer looked at him then. "For yourself, perhaps. You cannot accept it for my coachman, my horses, or the servants, who would have to bring you back if the road defeats you." His voice remained even, which made the refusal harder to push against. "No man gets to spend another person's neck on appearances." The room had gone quiet enough for Amelia to hear rain ticking against the tall windows. Ulrich coloured, but did not answer. Beside him, Iris lowered her eyes for a moment, as though the shape of the choice she had made had become harder to ignore. Mortimer turned back to Iris. "We will discuss what is to be said when everyone is safe. Until then, you are guests under my roof and will be treated as such." At the window, rain had begun striking the glass with the dry edge of sleet. Amelia read the outside thermometer, then opened the ledger to the evening column. The barometer had fallen faster than the last noon reading suggested. The margin she had allowed was gone. Water beneath the lower bend would begin freezing from the surface before the horses could be harnessed and a coach cleared from the estate. One reading remained untidy. Amelia's fingers hovered over the pencil. A month earlier, she would have sent someone back into the dark to settle it. Tonight, she measured the cost of waiting as carefully as the road itself. She turned. "The lower road closes now." Mortimer asked only, "You have enough to act. I will take the Roots horses and shelter rooms. I need you with the guests and coachmen. They will hear the danger more clearly from their host than from another column of figures." It was not surrendering authority. It was using his where hers ended. Mortimer nodded once. "Then I will hold the house while you close the road." Amelia crossed to the root board that had stood beside the hall doors since the first week. With one stroke of charcoal, she barred the lower road. "No carriage by the south gate," she told the steward. "Send a groom to the inner yard. Unhitch every departure and bring the horses under cover. The western track is for estate carts only and only until the next marker report." The orders travelled outward. Boots struck stone. Harness buckles rang in the coach court. The heavy gate bar thudded into place. Because they had practiced the shelter arrangement, no one had to invent it in the middle of fear. Servants carried blankets to the feast room. The elderly and those already chilled were kept in smaller rooms nearest the fires. Iris followed Amelia as far as the feast room door. "You cannot keep the whole party here. Do you know what they will say when the roads open?" Amelia took one end of a folded blanket from a maid and set it on a bench. "Almost certainly a great deal." She met Iris's eyes. "But they will be alive to say it." The first resistance came not from Iris, but from the guests. A gentleman near the fire demanded his carriage. Another insisted he had crossed worse roads in January. Then an elderly peer beside the stair let his gaze rest deliberately on Iris and Ulrich. "Your Grace," he said loud enough for half the room to hear, "are we truly to be kept here through the night in order to make this unfortunate affair appear respectable?" The whispers behind him sharpened. One lady raised her fan too late to hide the words she spoke to her neighbor. Someone else gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Iris went white. For an instant, Amelia understood exactly what Mortimer was being offered: one sentence of blame, one public distinction between himself and the pair who had humiliated him, and the room would probably give him its sympathy. He did not take it. Mortimer stepped where every face could see him. His voice did not rise. It grew quieter, and the room had to listen. "No, my lord. You are being kept here because the lower road is becoming unsafe." He indicated the route board, not Iris. "The old estate surveys show where the water collects. Miss Beaumont's measurements show that the surface is freezing before the bed beneath it. No Shawcross carriage will be sent over it tonight." The gentleman's mouth thinned. "And their presence has altered the number of beds required by 2. It has not altered the road." The answer was so precisely Mortimer that Amelia nearly smiled despite the tension. A murmur went through the hall. This time it did not vanish at once. Several guests still stared at Iris. One man looked openly disgusted. Mortimer let them look. He simply refused to convert their judgment into household policy. Then he added, "Miss Easton and Mr. Hartwell will have the same fire, food, and shelter as every other guest. If anyone wishes to debate reputation, the weather may first be persuaded to wait outside." A few faces changed not into approval, but into the reluctant expression of people who had been denied the pleasure of making safety-serve gossip. The coachmen had their answer. The servants had theirs. The room began to move. The feast room changed shape around them. Benches came forward. Blankets were stacked by the wall. The braziers were set with the clear passages Amelia had measured weeks before. In the kitchen, the altered ration plan left enough bread and broth for everyone, and the much-debated pie appeared in smaller pieces than the cook had once intended. A scullery child carried 2 slices away with solemn triumph. Half an hour later, a roadman arrived on foot through the inner yard. Sleet crusting his shoulders. The lower bend, he reported, had gone black and hard beneath the lantern. One cart had begun to slide before he turned it back. Amelia felt the last knot beneath her ribs loosen. They had not closed the road too soon. By midnight, the house had settled into an uneasy peace. The storm pressed at shutters and guttering, while voices in the feast room softened to tired conversation. Amelia checked the horse count once, then made herself stop. There was nothing left to prove outside. She went to the covered service arch near the Mews for a breath of cold air. Sleet hissed beyond the roofline. Warm lantern light ran over the wet bricks, the same wall, the same low step, the same coach court, where she had first found a stranger with his face in his hands. Mortimer stood beneath the arch. This time he was upright dry and holding 2 cups of hot spiced wine. He offered her one. Amelia accepted it, warming her fingers against the cup. "That is suspiciously close to practical kindness. I have been studying the method." His mouth moved. "I remember that you held out your hand to me here before you knew my name. I remember wondering whether you could stand. That was the remarkable part. You did not tell me not to cry. You wanted to know whether I could get indoors under my own power." Amelia looked out at the sleet. I was deciding whether you were about to become another entry in my weather book. A duke frozen beside his own stable would have spoiled the neatness of the page. Mortimer laughed low and tired. Miss Beaumont, the commission ends when the roads are properly open. When it does, I should like to court you. He paused, and for once his hesitation had nothing to do with a missing number. Not because you kept my guests safe, not because you found me here. I should like it because I am happier when you are arguing with me, and because every question becomes more interesting when I know what you think of it.
And when I am wrong?
Then we shall know more than we did before.
Amelia did not answer. The ledger rested against her hip. Her fingers moved toward its cover from habit and stopped. There was no column for this. If she said yes, there would be no measured point at which courtship became safe, no second reading that could guarantee she had not confused gratitude, desire, professional pride, and the dangerous pleasure of being understood. Worse, accepting him would change what other people saw when they looked at her work. Some would decide that every road mark carried a duke's indulgence instead of her judgment. She could refuse and preserve the cleanest possible boundary between her name and his. For several breaths, refusal looked like the safer calculation. Then she remembered that safety was not the only thing she had spent 7 weeks learning to measure. A plan that preserved every margin by removing the thing worth choosing was not necessarily a good plan. She looked at Mortimer. And when I am wrong, his answer came without ceremony. Then we shall know more than we did before. Not praise, not reassurance that she would rarely be wrong. A place for error to exist without erasing her. Amelia let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. There is no useful way to test this beforehand. I know. She studied his face. He had seen her be exact impatient, wrong-tired and too fond of a clean answer. None had made him ask her to become easier. He had been vain in his own way, had failed, had corrected himself where others could feel the difference. The choice before her had no safe margin and no calculation that could be repeated until it ceased to frighten her. Amelia set the cup on the stone ledge and held out her hand again. Then court me, your grace. We shall gather evidence as we go. Mortimer took her hand and bowed over her knuckles, his lips brushing them once. A dangerously unscholarly procedure. You may withdraw if the findings are dreadful. I rather think I shall dispute them. Amelia laughed, and together they went back inside. There were still people to feed. 1 year later, the same room held a small winter supper. No abandoned wedding silver waited beneath linen covers now. 8 places had been set because 8 people were expected, and the benches used during storms were stored behind the paneling ready if needed. The roadmen had permanent winter markers now. The kitchens kept a cold weather store count without waiting for crisis. Servants knew which rooms could be warmed quickly. Shawcross had learned to prepare for winter without behaving as though every winter were a catastrophe. Outside the night was cold and clear. Inside the fire burned steadily, and the last of the supper plates had been taken away. Amelia sat with her weather ledger beside her plate. During the year of courtship and the quieter months of marriage that had followed, Mortimer had never suggested the book belonged anywhere but under her hand. He had also learned that marriage did not make her forecasts more obedient. She checked her pocket watch, then the dark window. Then she checked it again. It was supposed to snow an hour ago. Mortimer across from her followed her glance toward a sky offensively full of stars. The weather appears unaware. The barometer fell almost exactly as it did in 1821. Amelia frowned at the page. The wind was within 2 points. It ought to be snowing. Then one of the conditions mattered less than we thought, or another mattered more. He lifted his wine. A mistake that survives long enough to teach us something is not entirely wasted. Amelia narrowed her eyes. You have stolen my professional language and made it into household philosophy. Openly. I find theft less exhausting than invention. She looked at the forecast. Once an error like this would have kept her awake, searching for the missing cause before she allowed herself any pleasure. Now she took up her pencil and drew one clean line through the prediction. She did not tear out the page. Tomorrow she would compare the wind, the pressure, and the ridge readings again. Tonight, the wrong answer could remain visible without becoming a verdict on the woman who wrote it. Amelia left the ledger open and reached for the last piece of bread. Next week we inspect the western... Your grandfather's map is wrong about the upper drainage. Mortimer's eyes brightened. You have not inspected it yet. I have suspicions. Excellent. I hope the map defeats you. You do not. No, he admitted. I hope you are insufferably pleased when you defeat it. Amelia rested one hand over the open ledger, then reached across the table and brushed her fingers against his. That is an observable fact. Their laughter stayed in the warm room while the winter night remained harmless beyond the glass and the crossed-out forecast lay open between them. The end.